We'll be sending an email that will have all the links to the things that we mentioned and some follow-up that you can do with regard to what we talk about this evening. So our first presenter tonight is Michael Waxenberg. He, as I said, is a mapper. He is going to talk about our Senate map and tell us some highlights and some areas of concern. And Michael, thank you for doing that.
Thanks very much, Carol. I hope you can hear me and see me. We have a packed agenda, so I'll just start out with a few broad observations on the Senate map and then maybe leave time for questions. I'm going to bring up the old and new maps side by side so that we can do an easy comparison. Now, from this aerial view, which I hope you can now all see, they may not look all that different, but once you get into the weeds, you start to see some important contrasts between the old map, which is on the left, and the new map, which is on the right. First and foremost, by most measures, if you take nothing else away about the Senate map tonight, you should know the new map is much, much better than the old map by just about any measure you could use. John and Dinos will take a deeper dive into the metrics a little later, but just quickly in terms of the basic constitutional requirements, the districts are more compact. They are more robustly contiguous. We don't have any districts that are held together by strip malls or waterways. Fewer counties and municipalities are split, so that's a good quantitative difference. No voting precincts at all are split statewide. Population variance is about the same between the two maps. It's right around 8%, difference between the highest and the lowest districts. But in general, communities of interest seem to have gotten more deference. And that's especially true in the few late adjustments from the preliminary maps. We saw some good stuff going on there. Another big change or improvement is the overall responsiveness of the map. I'm not referring here to the competitiveness of individual districts. That's a different topic. But the possibility of the chamber changing hands with changes in the statewide vote is what I'm referring to here. Minority Leader Costa has said, this was sort of a big selling point for him with the map, he said that the new map gives his party a chance or a path to the majority by 2024. And the numbers actually say that's true. It may be a narrow path, and it leads through maybe 6 counties as opposed to the whole map, but it is there. So that's a sample of the positives. And there are on the other side of the ledger some concerns. You've probably heard, and Carol alluded to this, that protecting incumbents was a priority for both Senate caucus leaders. That is probably true. And there are some fairly glaring examples scattered around the map where it just jumps out at you. I mean, for example, in the Lehigh Valley, it's quite obvious that some things were done to protect incumbents. But incumbent protection did not prevent the LRC from drawing what we consider a pretty good map. So while those compromises may be annoying and glaring, they didn't get in the way of good map craft. Now, from the Fair Districts perspective specifically, remember, Fair Districts has fought for some very specific reforms, and LACRA was sort of the centerpiece of that reform effort. One of the things that LACRA called for was limits on the number of ways or number of times that a county could be split. It is disappointing that 3 different counties actually represent what would be violations of LACRA, or that portion of LACRA on the Senate map. Berks, for example, has really been carved up. It's split 5 times. Luzerne County is split 4 times. Montgomery is the other, that's the third, and I think it's split 6 or 7 times. In terms of minority representation, on the plus side, the map does check the Mandatory Voting Rights Act boxes, and no current minority senator is endangered by the map. We did feel that opportunities for Pennsylvania to elect its first Hispanic senator are not quite as strong as we thought they could have been, especially in Philadelphia. But all in all, again, big picture, there is much to celebrate on the Senate map, and you can all take pride in the role that this group and others have played in that achievement. And so with that sort of big picture view on the table, I'll hand back to Carol, and maybe if we have time, we can take a few questions if there are good ones in the chat.
Well, would you like to zoom in and take a look at the Lehigh Valley? That's obviously an area of
Oh,
interest.
sure.
And concern.
I will. Yeah, let me expand this window and then zoom in.
Well, he's doing
So
that. I can answer a few. Well, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I was going to say one question that I saw in chat in the questions was, what does this, do the colors signify? The colors don't signify anything. They're just a way to tell the districts apart. So colors are just, and sometimes if the mappers are colorblind, the colors are very close and it's really hard to tell the districts apart. But the goal of the different colors is just to tell the districts apart. Go ahead, Michael.
So here's the Lehigh Valley, and we've got Lehigh County and Northampton County. The controversial point about the 14th district is that the 16th district kind of pokes into Allentown. You can see a little finger-like appendage from the 16th district protruding into the 14th. That happens to be the southern part of the city of Allentown. And the reason for that, quite simply, is that Senator Pat Brown lives there. And one of the deals that they struck was that he would be protected in a relatively red 16th district, and he wouldn't have to run in a very deep blue 14th district. Now, the 14th district becomes open territory. It's actually a district that was relocated from northeastern Pennsylvania. It was previously held by an incumbent, John Utacek. Now it's up for grabs. And although it is not a majority minority district, or a plurality Hispanic district, it is reasonably considered an opportunity possibly for a Hispanic candidate or a minority candidate. We'll see how that plays out. The preliminary map actually included the Lehigh County portion of the city of Bethlehem in the 14th, but that portion of Bethlehem was reunited with the Northampton portion of Bethlehem in the final map, partly as a community of interest measure and partly because the incumbent Senator Buscola wanted it that way. Was there another area we should zoom in on,
There
Carol?
were questions about why did Berks, I mean, maybe all three, the districts the counties that were divided so much, why do you think that's the case?
Okay. The one I know the most about is northeastern Pennsylvania, Luzerne specifically. What happened there was that there are pieces of Luzerne that are helpful to 4 different incumbents. And in particular, you'll notice that the 22nd district protrudes down along the line of the Wyoming Valley to pick up the city of Wilkes-Barre. So by combining Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, the 22nd becomes a much bluer district than it would be if it only had the one city, Scranton. So that's part of it. The 20th district, this pink horseshoe that wraps around Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, and actually that's my district, unfortunately. It's been that way for 55 years, and it's going to stay that way for another 10 years. Basically, the 20th district has been a colony of the Republican Party of Luzerne County for 60 years. So that's considered their territory, and they got to keep it. And the other 2 segments were added on to districts held by Republican incumbents to deepen the redness of their districts, or just to fill out population. As far as Berks, Berks is kind of stuck at a crossroads and tends to get carved up on all kinds of maps. With regard to this particular configuration, the swath cut through the middle of Berks County, the 11th district, again, some incumbent protection going on there for a Democratic incumbent whose district largely revolves around the city of Reading, but she lives up in Ruscombe Manor, and so they had to draw her in. So a lot of this is accounted for by incumbent protection. Montgomery is a more complicated story. There are incumbents in the city of Philadelphia who wanted a piece of the wealthier towns in Montgomery County included in their districts because their donor base is an important part of their power base. So again, there's a different story behind each of these districts. There's a different story behind each county. we try not to speculate too much about the motives and focus on the bottom line result. And the bottom line result is it's a good map. And so if you worry too much about how the sausage was made, you really can't make yourself crazy.
So let's pause here. And I will say, I want to celebrate two districts that I'm quite pleased about, because two districts that really troubled me, leave it right where it is, and point to 15 and 48. If you remember, 15 and 48, both of those cross the Susquehanna River. In both of those, divided up Dauphin County, and Dauphin County is now a little bit more, makes a little bit more sense. The Harrisburg area is put back together, and neither of those is crossing the river in places where you can't actually cross. So there are some things to celebrate in the map. But as Michael made very clear, there's also quite a lot of partisan protection going on. And we know that this map was very much a negotiation between the two Senate leaders, and they were looking out for their caucuses. And that's the process that we have right now. But I will say, as Michael mentioned, the metrics on this map are far better than the metrics before. We will take more time later to look more closely, but we do have some other things that we want to look at. And we're going to shift over to Michael Skros. He's going to talk to us a little bit about the House map. Well, he's getting ready to do that. Well, Michael, go ahead and go ahead, share a screen and get ready to talk. The question is, what happens with these maps? Are these maps final? They are final. There's a 30-day window for folks to appeal to the court. Chairman Nordenberg is a consummate lawyer. He's a legal professor, and I believe that he did an amazing job of laying a strong legal foundation for these maps. I have trouble picturing any legal challenge that would make any changes to these maps. I think it's important for candidates to go ahead and start preparing to run for office based on these maps. I think you should assume that these maps are final, and we will be watching to see if anybody does try to lodge an appeal. But as I said, there's a great deal of good testimony supporting these maps. We'll get into a little bit of that as we go on today. Assume that these maps are the final maps. And I will say just a word or two about primary, because I saw that question come up. We don't actually know the timetable for that. We are waiting to hear from the Supreme Court. Will they change the candidate nomination petition but leave the primary, or will they leave the primary? We'll see. We might know even more as people put information in chat. We keep waiting to hear. If anybody has any insight into that, feel free to share it. And we're going to let Michael go ahead and tell us a little bit about what happened with the House map. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you, Carol. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to the House map, since there are so many districts to cover. So what I focused in on in this slideshow is taking portions of the state where the LRC made some significant changes from their preliminary map to the final draft of the map. So from the current map that's in place to the LRC's map, there is a massive improvement on almost every metric. The districts are more compact, there's less splitting, the map is more proportional, communities of interest are better served. So the map as a whole is really strong, and the preliminary map that was released in December was really strong. So there were really just a couple of tweaks that were made based on testimony submitted. So I'm just going to do kind of zip through different portions of the state to point out where changes were made, why they may have been made, and then where changes were not made. So I'll start in Allegheny because that is where there were pretty significant changes. So if you see in District 33, I'll start off there because there was a hearing it was a pretty partisan hearing in McCandless over the fact that it was split in the preliminary map. So in the final draft map, District 33 was changed to keep that township whole. Similarly, in Etna, which is in House District 21, the orange district over here, it was split up from its school district, so the LRC remedied that with their final map. So this is Southwest Allegheny County. So this is where in a hearing in early January, I believe, there were 4 representatives who testified, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and they proposed what they wanted their districts to look like. So I'm sure some of that was genuine, trying to make sure communities of interest were represented, but also there was some benefit to themselves. But they proposed this middle configuration of their 4 districts. And if you can tell from the changes that were made from the preliminary map for these districts in the southwest part of the county, as well as part of Washington County, the LRC map matches up pretty well with that proposal by those 4 representatives. And that was a pretty significant area of change on the House map. Bethel Park was joined with Peters Township, which there was a lot of testimony supporting. And they were trying to draw areas of Allegheny and Washington County that had some similarities and common communities of interest together. So that's, I think, is the biggest area of change in the entire map, from what I can tell, is southern Allegheny County. As well as still in Allegheny County, Aspinwall was an area, it's a very tiny township. It was split up, and that was remedied in the final map. So moving on, but staying in the western part of the state, Lawrence and Butler County, unfortunately, is an area where the preliminary LRC map was great. It created much more compact districts compared to the current map in place. But unfortunately, the final map kind of took a step back. And if you can tell from this map, there's a pretty clear reason. So 2 incumbents, Representatives Bonner and Bernstein, were grouped together in a district. And now magically, the new map that was proposed has them in their own districts. So that's an example of where the LRC did take a bit of a step back for pretty obvious reasons. So moving on to Erie County, just real quick, there were some minor changes made to the 2nd district to keep a school district whole. And District 6 took on a little bit more of Erie County to get a lower population variance. So just another example of really minor tweaks that were responsive to testimony received by the LRC. Another area of interest based on testimony is Juniata and Mifflin counties. There was a lot of testimony asking for the current House District 82 to remain as it is on the current map today. And it was focusing in on joining Juniata and Mifflin together. It's unclear whether this testimony was motivated by the fact that 2 incumbents are drawn together in the new map, or whether there was genuine interest in keeping those 2 counties together. And that's an area where the LRC did not make any changes, and those 2 incumbents are still drawn in together. And I think part of that is because there is inevitably, with the population changes, things do need to be moved around on these maps. So I think that is a reason why they didn't take that testimony into account. And just north of that, if you go into Lycoming County, so District 84 is the district that was held up by Representative Benninghoff after the preliminary map was approved. District 84 was a clear gerrymander, according to him. He had printouts of it, was holding them up, waving them around. As you can see between the 2 maps, they did make 84. It doesn't wrap around District 83 as much as it does. But I think based on this map that does map the incumbents, it's a deep red area. So there is no partisan gerrymandering going on between these districts. The only real reason is to keep these 4 representatives in their own districts. So that's an example of, once again, these maps were drawn to keep incumbents relatively safe. And just because a district has an interesting shape to it does not mean it was drawn for a certain party necessarily. It could be for a certain politician. So just wanted to point that out. And then another area of positive change was in Dauphin County. There was a lot of testimony to add Hummelstown to District 106 to be with Hershey. That's identified as a community of interest. And the LRC responded to that comment, made some minor tweaks. So District 106 and 104 swapped some area along the Susquehanna so that those communities could be grouped together. And now I'll focus on the eastern part of the state where there were fewer changes compared to the west. So York and Lancaster has no change despite some testimony, specifically from Lancaster County. There was testimony asking for the Penn Manor School District, which is currently split in the maps, to be reunited into a single district. And there were some other comments about districts 43 and 99. These changes, there were no changes that resulted from that testimony. So something else that's interesting is in Chester County. This is an area of pretty minor change between District 74 and 155. And this is where a state representative, Friel Otten, testified to the LRC that the proposed map actually split the campus of the Brandywine Hospital, which was recently shut down. And there's a lot of efforts by the county officials to address that situation. And the current map kind of distilled the voice of those parties associated with the hospital since the campus was split. So the new map does remedy that by avoiding that split, by adding more of Cown to District 74, and in return giving West Brandywine to District 155. And that also does enhance the minority representation in District 74. It boosts the minority percentage from 28% to 30%, which isn't much, but it is something. And Philadelphia is just an area where there isn't much change. But I would note, if you zoom in, you do see that there was supposed to be two incumbents, Representatives Robb and Delicio, drawn in together. Now it is Representatives Robb and Fitzgerald drawn into a primary battle, which is interesting. So that change was made. And then Bucks and Montgomery, same story, very little change. Horsham was originally split in the preliminary proposal. It is now reunified in the final map in District 151. But this is an area where there's so many incumbents, and since the maps were previously drawn for partisan purposes, it's really hard to draw districts in a favorable way that keeps communities of interest together when there are those incumbents that are being taken into account. And that becomes clear in these areas where the LRC really can't politically make any changes that are going to be accepted by the party leaders making those decisions. And then I'll just wrap it up with Pike County. This is where the Delaware Township in District 139 was initially split. They reunified it. And then in Northampton County, they added the northeastern part of the county to District 138 to reunify the townships that consider themselves part of the Slate Belt. And they also undid a split of a school district. So I just wanted to highlight all these different areas. It was a lot at once, but just to show that the LRC did take into account a lot of citizen testimony. It's pretty impressive to make a lot of these changes without disrupting other districts. So it's clear when they could, and when politically it was palatable, they did take into account the voices of citizens of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Michael. You gave us a whirlwind tour. We didn't get to everything. If we have time, I see some folks putting questions, and we will take a look at those. If you want to stop your screen share, that would be good. Just a reminder, every change requires other changes. And so unsplitting one thing often requires splitting something else. And so the challenge very much for the mappers, whoever they are, is to balance the questions, balance the priorities, balance the requests, and also get the votes they need to get the maps passed, which means keeping the caucus leaders agreeing that they are willing to vote. And I know that for Chairman Nordenberg, he very much wanted a bipartisan map. He wanted votes from all of the caucus leaders. And you can see in some of the things that Michael just showed you, there are places where the Republican incumbents were given what they asked for. So when Representative Benninghoff says, we were shut out of the process, we had no involvement in this map, you can look at that rearrangement of Lawrence, Mercer, and Butler County. That's very clear evidence that Republican incumbents had a say in how this map was drawn. Also, you can look at that area, District 84 that Michael showed us, that was supposedly a gerrymander, even though it's a completely Republican area. That change was suggested by the legislator whose district it is. So, and there's quite a few places where you can look at it and say, these were concessions to Republican incumbents that were made to get vote from the majority leader, and yet he then said we had nothing to do with this. This map is a Democratic gerrymander. I think that was probably pretty disappointing to Chairman Nordenberg, who I think had worked really hard to negotiate and to compromise. And that's the process that we currently have. 4 out of 5 commissioners are still party leaders. 4 out of 5 commissioners still owe their top loyalty to their caucuses, who are the ones who keep them in their positions. That's the reality of what we have. But we do want to keep saying these maps are far better than what we had before. So I'm going to turn it over to our 2 experts, Dinos Gonatas and John Nagle. John is a professor emeritus from Carnegie Mellon. He has been part of the Common Cause PA redistricting working group for years. He has written on this topic extensively. He was one of the judges for our mapping competition last summer. And Dinos is originally from Pennsylvania. He no longer lives in Pennsylvania, but he's followed our efforts. And he is a consultant who works on data, predictive data, creating sophisticated computer methods to do predictive analysis. I hope I'm not mangling this. And he was also one of the experts who worked with us on our mapping competition. Both of them offered testimony to the LRC. John's was recorded, and you can find his presentation and testimony will be shared in the link. And they're going to talk a little bit about analytics, criteria, and how these maps work in those important areas. So handing it over to you.
All right, so let me share my screen. And I want to share screen 1. Hold on a minute. Okay, everybody can see it. So as Carol mentioned, Chairman Nordenberg gave me more than the usual time to talk about the House map on that was on January 15th. And the conclusion that I had then was simply that the preliminary House map was still biased in favor of the GOP. And for tonight, I still have that conclusion, of course, but I want to do updates. And for one thing, I want to bring in the Senate map, which I didn't talk about at all before, as well as, of course, we have the final plans now, and I'm going to compare those with the preliminary plans, as well as with the FDPA people's maps and the current plans. So, and I'm focusing primarily on bias. I'll say something about responsiveness later on, but it's primarily my thing is bias. So let me go to the next slide, if I can. Yes, so let me define the axes on this graph, and let me get my pointer. I think it helps to have my pointer here. So the vertical axis is the estimate of the Democratic seats if and when the vote is 50% for the 2 parties. Okay. And the horizontal graph, the horizontal axis, just compares the current map, the LRC preliminary map, the LRC, sorry, this is the FDPA map, this is LRC preliminary, and this is LRC final. This estimate is basically the seats bias metric in DRA. So everything I'm showing you is in DRA, but you have to do a little more work than what DRA does for you in order to see what I'm going to show you. Sorry, Carol, here's an equation, but the seats bias is this number, and you can calculate the number of Democratic seats. I wish the DRA would do that, but they don't. So at any rate, it's clear that the current map was quite biased way down here, giving many fewer than half the seats to the Democrats, even if they get half the vote. The preliminary map was considerably better. Sorry, I keep saying this. my screen is covered up. My axis is covered up here by the share screen thing. But this is the FDPA, which was considerably better. But interestingly, the preliminary map was even better than the FDPA people's map, and the final map was just a smidgen even better than the preliminary map. I was sure that it would go down when they did the final map, but it didn't. The next slide. Oh, sorry. This is the. I'm sorry. There's something went wrong with my PowerPoint. But anyway, it's the same. This is the Senate, and what I just showed you was the House. So the Senate again. Now the FDPA map is over here, and the current one was strongly biased. The preliminary map and the final map was better than the preliminary map, but it still wasn't quite as good as the FDPA map. So I think that should make FDPA people happy. But I got the slides out of order, and so I don't know what's going on with my. This is the one I showed you first, and it was one I was going to show you second, because in this case, the FDPA map wasn't as good as the final LRC map. Now let me just say something here. I'm not sure if you've seen it. You may have seen things like this, but you'll notice that I have error bars or uncertainties on the estimates that I have. And this is something important, which unfortunately DRA does not give you, but you can get it if you work at it. So what this is, and now I'm sorry, Carol, I'm going to deep dive into something a little bit so that you've got the bottom lines already, but I need to justify the methodology. And so let me get a little bit under the hood. What I'm showing here, let's take this one here for the LRC final. These are the estimates that are given from 7 different elections that DRA allows you to choose, okay? And they all give different numbers, okay, of course, all right? Now, but let me emphasize, those different numbers are not because they had different overall votes in the elections of those statewide races. Those are actually shifted down to 50%. So there's not that much difference in these, but there is a mean. And that's what you saw on the last slide. And the uncertainties are the standard error of the mean, not the standard deviation. So the standard error of the mean is actually gives you an idea, gives you the best estimate of what your mean value is. The standard deviation gives you the spread, and that would be 3 times bigger than the standard error of the mean. So at any rate, the point that I wanted to make is that we have actually had elections. So now come back to the current map. So the same data give me this spread, but we've actually had elections for the current map. And those elections, the last 4 of them, were given by these boxes here with a mean that is here, which is very close to the mean that we get by doing this estimation process using statewide votes on the statewide races. So the methodology seems to be pretty consistent. Now, the next point that I want to make, though, is that if those of you who read the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is informed usually by the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, will tell you that it says that the final map will give the Democrats roughly 101 seats. Well, I can get 101 seats if I choose that election, okay? But if I look at all of them, I have a mean which unfortunately is rather more discouraging, okay? So the map, even though it's much better than the old map, it still isn't fair. We still have a bias in favor of the Republicans. So let me see, yeah. Hold on just a second. I think I had something else I wanted to say there, but I've forgotten what it was. Okay, so sorry, Carol, a bit more methodology here. And by the way, this part is in my in the talk that I gave to the LRC. It's the old issue of what's the best metric for analysis of bias. And that's actually a difficult question. I have a paper that gets into that. And it's difficult for unbalanced states like Massachusetts or South Carolina. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that Pennsylvania is a well-balanced purple state. And if you look at the elections for the last 4 House elections, the average vote was 48.9% Democratic. The Senate, it was 49.0% Democratic. We're really about, for these elections, it's really well balanced. And so the answer for what is the best metric for analysis of bias is you only need to look at the seats bias. And by the way, in DRA metrics, that's under the advanced section, because it's evaluated at 50% of the 2-party vote. And the other seats metrics agree at 50%. So specifically, don't look at the DRA at proportionality in DRA if you're using the DRA composite data, because that's shifted from 50%. So let me just mention very briefly about responsiveness. And the current map actually was more responsive than the LRC final map. The preliminary map was the least responsive. This is for the Senate, red is for the Senate, and black is for the House. So the preliminary map was less responsive. The final map became more responsive, but it still wasn't as responsive as the current map. And the FDPA maps were the most responsive. Okay, not surprising because FDPA didn't take into account incumbency the way that the LRC apparently had to do, unfortunately. But let me just comment that even though the responsiveness hasn't gotten better, at least it's better than proportionality. Proportionality would only have a responsiveness of 1, okay? And these responsivenesses are actually consistent with the US norm and are consistent with the efficiency gap ideal, which would be 2. So it's not terrible, but all of us, I think, many of us would like to have it even more responsive than it is. So summary so far, the LRC House plan is biased in favor of Republicans by about 2%. I estimate that at 50% of the vote, it would be 97 Democratic seats. So these are comments that I made to the LRC. Why should the GOP be upset? Well, of course, it's less biased than the old map, and that's what they would like to have. But of course, the other thing is, why shouldn't Democrats be upset? And of course, the problem is that it's very hard to get a fair map in Pennsylvania because of the political geography of having Democrats packed in the cities. So the LRC Senate plan, though, has twice as much bias as the House plan. But as has been commented on, at least it got a bipartisan vote in the final vote. And the responsiveness, as I just mentioned, is a bit smaller than it was before. And I think that's because incumbents were being protected.
Thank you, John.
There was one address to you about the population imbalance between regions, and I neglected to cover that when I was talking about the Senate map. Do you want to cover that now?
Sure. So there was a population gap between regions. I gave testimony on it. Other folks gave testimony on it. The Senate map had not done a good job of rebalancing population shift. The final map did not really, it did a little tweaking of that. It brought it down a little bit. It moved it a little. It shifted the great imbalance out of Philadelphia to the surrounding regions, but it didn't fully address that. And so again, we go back to the map that we have is better than what we've had. It has less bias. It's more compact, but it still has built into it incumbent bias. And that is a piece of not fixing the population deviation. I think if there had been more time, there might have been more time to negotiate more changes to it. But I do want us to remember that this commission was working under a very tight timeline. They got the data very late. They were supposed to have 90 days to draw their preliminary map, but they drew it much faster. So they've been under a very tight timeline, and that has impacted. I want us to be generous towards what the commission did. They did a phenomenal job in drawing a much better map. It's not to the point where we would like it, and there are still things that we would have liked to see change. But given the time frame, given the extreme gerrymandering of the past, I think they did a phenomenal job. And I think we need to be appreciative, even while we continue to say there needs to be a better process, and there are places we would have liked to see the map do better. So handing it back to Dinos. Go ahead, Dinos.
Great. So can I assume that other folks can see the screen share?
Yes, we can.
Great. Excellent. So one of the constitutional requirements for maps for legislative districts is compactness. And if you see here, I've got the current map with there's a couple of these compactness measures. I'm not going to get into what they are, but just take my word for it that the higher this number is, the more compact it is. As you get to a value of 1, it's the compactness you'd have if all the districts were circles. So the LRC preliminary map is a big improvement over the current map. And then there's basically not really too much change to the final map. And the FDPA map is shown here over on the right. So generally, this shows progress. It's not necessarily humongous amounts of progress, but it is progress. One of these measures does show a big jump from the current map to the new maps. The second important measure of these maps, again, a constitutional requirement, is county splits. So for the House map, what you see is there were over 200, I think 224 splits in the current map, and that was dropped to 100, I think 184 or 186 splits in the LRC preliminary map. The LRC final map increased that by a couple splits. So enacting some of those compromises and requests from incumbents and generate just a couple more of those splits. I don't necessarily think they're fatal. It's still a big improvement over the current map. And the FDPA People's Map is about 200 splits. And I should say that, and I've drawn maps and I have software for reducing splits. Reducing splits is really, really hard. So, especially in the House, at the scale of the House map with 203 districts. In the state Senate map, there was a big improvement from the current map to the LRC preliminary district. What surprised me is those small changes that Michael was talking about towards the final version actually increased the splits quite a bit. But nobody seemed to complain, and the vote was unanimous, just like in the death of Stalin, when the Politburo was trying to decide what sort of funeral arrangements they should have. So, which is pretty surprising for a committee with so many different voices. I just had a couple, if you want, I can talk about the simulations and the bias, or should I just skip that?
Yeah, do that. Give us a few minutes worth of that. Yep.
It'll be short. So,
Yep.
So one of the approaches that people often take to judge whether a map is fair, at least to some point, is have computers do simulations. And basically all that is it's like you have a whole bunch of monkeys drawing maps at random, surrounded. They do have the constraints that there has to be population balance and there has to be contiguity. And sometimes you can impose additional constraints. But basically, it's these guys right here drawing the maps. And would those be very biased? In the past, in litigation going on for the last 10 years, a huge point was that many of the maps drawn by Republicans were such incredible outliers that if you had random people drawing maps blindly, it would take like 1 trillion years to get a map as biased as the ones they came up with. So this is one of the approaches that's been seen in litigation. And the Republican witness showed a distribution of seats. Again, there's sort of a lot of scatter when you draw maps randomly. And for the House, this is, again, the contention was all centered on the House map, not the Senate map, which was drawn with bipartisan support. But the House map was very contentious. And the Republican witness said that on average, you shouldn't get more than 97 seats if you're drawing maps blindly. And yet he claims that the LRC map, the preliminary map, had 107 seats. And that was his claim. And then I worked on trying to investigate if that was true. And the Democrats hired their own expert witness who had actually written the software that the Republican witness used to calculate his map average. And what he found is that basically he found that he couldn't agree with what the Republican witness got. And he basically got a 3-seat discrepancy if you have a race blind simulation. And then if you force some districts to be Black and some districts to be Hispanic as minority opportunity districts, he would get a 10-seat discrepancy. At the same time, the algorithm that he used was very complicated. He was not sure what the Republican witness did. And it should also be noted that the Republican witness just added all the votes from 2012 to 2020, which strongly overweights all the races where you had presidential election years. So in 2018, where you had a blowout re-election of a Democratic governor and senator, those votes for the House and Senate candidates would be de-weighted compared to the presidential election year. So that already skews, this sort of analysis already skews more to the Republicans. And then we did our own analysis using a different set of methods. And we got a lot more Democratic seats than either the Democratic witness or the Republican witness. And again, our methods are different, although very well respected. In fact, we had invited one of the authors of these methods to speak, but she's busy in the congressional litigation. And I did this a couple different ways. And the purple is the distribution that you get when you're constraining for county splits to keep them under around 188, which is a reasonable number for county splits for the state house. And in green, which is just a naive distribution when you don't have any county splits constraints whatsoever, which gives you a little more of a Republican district bias, but it's still way off from what the Republican witness got using software that's very specialized, I would say a little hard to use, and it's really quite complex on the scale of the Pennsylvania House districts. And people don't realize this, but when you have 203 districts you're trying to carve out of a huge map, it's just as hard for computers as it is for people. And it's very hard to really shuffle the deck if you're doing a random simulation in a way that gives you a smoothly sampled distribution. But what we do see is that nobody could really duplicate what the Republican witness got. And we have some arguments over methods that sort of devolve into disagreements among scientists, but the Republican witness seemed to be an outlier. So if you want to yield, I'm ready to move on.
Can you go back to your very first slide, Dinos? I think there was somebody asking about your first slide.
Right.
Let's see if,
so this is on the compactness.
yeah.
So the top one is the state house, the bottom one is the state senate, but again, the progression is pretty similar.
Yeah, so we're seeing that good. Yeah, thank you. That's really good. That's very helpful. So basically what we're seeing is that in all the legally required criteria, the new maps are far better. This is Dinos. Oh, you know, his name, Dinos, I didn't change your name this time. The first time
that's okay.
you used
But actually, there's one
Michael's,
thing that came up. I was looking at the final state senate map today on Dave's redistricting, and some of the districts near Lancaster are non-contiguous, which I found very puzzling.
Yeah, I think that has more to do with Dave's. We've been going back and forth between Dave's redistricting app and the whatever the software was in use. That I think it's a Dave's issue more than an actual mapping issue. And I will say, so the person who's been speaking was Dinos Gonatas. I'm not sure if I'm saying your last name correctly, but he is not Michael Waxenberg, but he used Michael Waxenberg's link. And I did not change his name. So when you see it, the name will be Michael Waxenberg. That's we didn't get his name changed, but that was not Michael, that was Dinos talking. I'm going to talk just a few minutes about minority representation because that's a topic that's come up. It's a topic that has been discussed by my majority leader, Carrie Benninghoff, some people have asked questions about specific districts. And so I want to just, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a voting rights expert, and I'm certainly not an analyst of any of this, but I want to just say a few words about this topic. And we're not going to take raised hands. If you have questions, you need to put them in the Q&A. I know we've answered a lot of questions in Q&A, and hopefully we'll get to a few of them to talk through out loud. But I first do want to just talk a little bit about minority representation and the messaging around that. And part of the messaging has been that there's been reduction of population numbers in minority districts, and that is going to cause vote dilution and less representation for minority community members. I was really struck by the testimony of Dr. Matt Barretto, who spoke at the LRC hearing on January 14th. I have a quote from him in a little bit, but we'll also share the link to his testimony and his presentation, because he did a really good job of explaining some of what's going on in looking at our districts. And I know that there was a voting rights expert, it might have been him, who worked with Minority Leader Joanna McClinton in preparing that part of the map, in looking at the questions surrounding minority districts. So a thing to know is that districts do not have to be a supermajority of Black or Hispanic, in other words, 50% of one or the other, to be considered a workable or productive minority district. Insistence on 50% voting age population can actually be considered packing and can prevent the minority group from influence in a second nearby district. Courts have allowed Black and Hispanic populations to be combined into coalition districts, and increasing population percentage in one district to create a safer district for a minority group can actually decrease overall representation for that group, and can also result in packing Democrats, yielding an overall Republican advantage, which is precisely why Representative Carrie Benninghoff would like to see minority members packed more into specific districts, because that would be one way to give a higher Republican advantage. And the map that he proposed does exactly that. It packs more minority members, and it yields a much higher bias on behalf of Republicans. So I want to I've been thinking about what's a way to actually show this visually, and I want to share this. I'm not sure this is the best way to do it. I'll welcome feedback, but I'm trying to help think through what when we talk about unpacking districts or expanding representation, how would we do that? So imagine this is your population. Each of those represents, say, 10,000 people or 6,000 people. So we have districts of about 60,000 voting age folks. And so you've got a district that's 50% Black and 80% BIPOC. BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, people of color. It's a way to kind of talk about minority communities. So you have another district, which is 50% Latino, 70% BIPOC, 50% Latino, 100% BIPOC. And then you've got three districts that are majority white. And so you end up with this little world that I've created here. Imagine this is one of our Pennsylvania small cities. Imagine this is a place like Reading or Allentown. 3 BIPOC districts, 1 Black, 2 Latino. Now, we have voices saying, well, we need to make sure that these districts are safe for our minority candidates. So we actually need to have higher population for those minority, especially for Latinos, because citizen voting age population is smaller than voting age population. So we want to have higher voting age population for those groups. So we'll keep the one with the 50% Black the same. We'll increase the Latino population in one, we'll increase the Latino population in another. And that still yields us 3 BIPOC districts, 1 Black, 2 Latino, 3 white districts, no added representation. So what I'm trying to say is increasing the minority percentage in a district does not actually yield added representation in Harrisburg. And so if you have a population and you want to add representation in Harrisburg, you need to go in the other direction. You need to unpack your minority population. So let's do it differently. So 50% BIPOC, 30% Black. So we've gone down a little bit, 60% BIPOC, 40% Latino. So we've gone down significantly in the Latino population, but we still have a minority coalition that's more than a majority. The next one will do 60% BIPOC, 40% Latino, 60% BIPOC, 50% Latino. And then we'll have one that's 30% Latino, 30% Black, and one that's 50% BIPOC, 40% Black. Now look what's happened here. Suddenly we have 6 minority districts, 2 with a Black majority, 3 with a Latino majority. One could go either way with a Latino or a Black legislator. Now think about this, even if one of these districts doesn't work out the way that you wanted, have you expanded representation? Yeah, you've gone from 3 to 5. Even if 2 of these don't work out the way you'd like, you've still expanded representation. You've gone from 3 to 4. And that's exactly what the proposed map does. And one of the questions is, how do you find the right balance between packing minority voters into a district or diluting them so much that they don't have a say? Packing, is it 50%? Is it 60%? Vote dilution, 30%, 35%? This is all being tested out in courts right now. It's all being tested out in looking at voting analysis. And a lot of it has to do with the specifics of the local community. There's no magic threshold. It has a lot to do with how the communities vote. So vote analysis is really important. And courts will look at the analysis to see if the district will perform in the way that the minority community wants. Local community voices matter. The local voting patterns matter. So I mentioned Dr. Matt Barreto, and he has an incredible resume. And one of the questions I noticed was, there have been some experts put forward who are not experts in their field. And it's really important. I'm kind of appalled at several of the experts that the Commonwealth Court judge's opinion was based on. It looked like she took the 2, I'm going to do air quotes for experts, the 2 who had the least experience in the field, the least no peer-reviewed work at all, the 2 who had no peer-reviewed work and who were not in any way experts on what they were opining about. Those were the 2 whose testimony she gave most weight. And so Dinos mentioned Dr. Michael Barber. He was one of those in Commonwealth Court. He was also one who gave testimony for the LRC hearing. He loves to give testimony, as Chair Nordenberg pointed out. He has not been invited to speak at any kind of academic gathering. He has no peer-reviewed work on this. He simply likes to give partisan testimony and be invited to speak in litigation, but his results are questionable. This expert, Dr. Matt Barreto, is one of the nationally known experts. He has started organizations. He has taught a great deal. He has spoken at every prominent gathering of Latino or Hispanic officials. And he analyzed the current House map. And this is what he said: multiple Black performing and Latino performing districts are packed. And that means that there's vote dilution for those minority voters. Given the growth of the minority population in parts of the state, existing minority districts should be unpacked and new minority performing districts should be created to comply with the Voting Rights Act. When he looked at the LRC map, he said the minority performing districts in the preliminary plan will perform for minority voters. Also in the most recent hearing, Chairman Nordenberg read a letter from Representatives Danilo Burgos, Angel Cruz, and Manuel Guzman, basically approving of the proposed map and saying this will work for us. They said, since the approval of the preliminary map, there's been a significant amount of discussion about how this map impacts communities of color in the Commonwealth. As Latino members of the House, we feel compelled to address these important concerns. And there we go. We applaud the work that you have done to ensure these communities, which have been underrepresented in the legislature for far too long, are fairly represented. The preliminary plan is responsive to the growth of the Latino population in many important ways. Statewide, this plan creates 9 districts in which Latino communities should be able to elect their candidates of choice. 3 of those districts will be open seats with no incumbent member, meaning a Latino candidate of choice would not need to overcome the power of incumbency in order to be elected. Latino representation is lacking in Pennsylvania, particularly when you consider the growth that has occurred across Pennsylvania over the last decade. And they conclude the preliminary plan for House districts makes major strides in correcting this injustice and restoring fairness in representation in Pennsylvania. As Latino members of the House, we embrace the goal of the LRC and applaud their work. We look forward to serving in a more diverse legislature. Chairman Nordenberg also shared a letter from Representative Donna Bullock, who is chair of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus, which said pretty much the same thing. I've watched this closely. I'm impressed by the process, the commitments to fairness and transparency, and I'm pleased to fully endorse this preliminary plan as responsive to the growth of communities of color across the Commonwealth. In addition to preserving and expanding districts in which a racial minority makes up the majority of the population, the plan takes the important step of including coalition districts. These districts in which diverse communities of color make up a majority or plurality of the population recognize the commonalities of Black, Latino, Asian, and Indigenous Pennsylvanians and will allow these communities to fully realize their political power. I want to thank you for your tireless efforts in the redistricting cycle and for recognizing that the diversity of this Commonwealth is a strength. Your efforts have led to a plan that will uplift rather than dilute our voices. So I'll say that if you hear complaints about the districts that are drawn, will they represent minority communities? I think it's important to point to the fact that minority legislators have endorsed the LRC plan, and that the person who is saying that the plan will not serve community members is the majority leader, under whom, just to share a few interesting statistics, there have been bills introduced by 273 bills, by our count, introduced in this session by members of the Hispanic and the Black legislative caucuses. 273 bills. Of those bills, only 5 have been voted out of committee. 2 of those were bills to name roads. One of those was the bill on prison gerrymandering, which was badly mangled and amended in committee, and then voted out with a negative recommendation. And none of them have been given a vote on the House floor. So I would say that if Representative Benninghoff is interested in expanding minority representation, the first place to do that would be to let minority legislators have their bills be given a vote. I want to just look quickly at 4 districts that are of interest. First of all, Dauphin County, this district was created without an incumbent to provide minority opportunity in the Dauphin County area. This one is District 22. It's a brand new district moved into Allentown to create a Hispanic majority district. This one is Norristown in Montgomery County. It's one I'll confess, in mapping, I've spent a lot of time looking at our map, looking for where are there ways to maximize minority representation. These last 2, I was surprised and impressed that the mappers found these opportunities. I had not seen them. Norristown, it doesn't reach 50%, but it comes close and provides a really good coalition district for an urban area. And this last one is one you would not expect. It's the Hazleton area, Luzerne and Schuylkill counties. Again, it doesn't reach 50%, but it comes close. And it has a large Hispanic population. And given the way this district is drawn, a Latino representative could actually win an election in that particular district. I'm going to leave this last one up. There's a ton of information there, but there were some questions about how many paired House incumbents are there. There are 9, 4 D versus R, 4 R versus R, and 1 D versus D. There's 1 set of paired Senate incumbents, 1 Republican against the only independent in our state Senate. There are currently 3 Senate districts without incumbents. And this is, I think, may be a record. 27 at the moment, 27 House seats that will not have incumbents. So there are legislators announcing every day that they won't be running. Some of them have not paid attention to their constituents for years. And as the districts change, they look and say, maybe that's going to be too hard. Some, the partisan composition of their districts have shifted, and rather than face into what will be more difficult, they just say, yeah, I'm not going to run. A few of those who were put into matched pairs have chosen not to run again. And then there were 11 districts created deliberately with no incumbent to open space for new candidates. So I'll leave that there for just a minute so you can take a look and see if there's any districts near you. And I want to say, I think a really important thing here, and one reason we wanted to have this forum quickly, is the timeline is short for people to realize that there are districts without incumbents, which means that there are new opportunities for new voices, for minority candidates, for folks who have thought, well, I can't run against that person. He's been in that district for 20 years. There's no chance. Suddenly, there are some new opportunities, which means it's important to look and to see where are those opportunities, and maybe to think about how can we, as people who care deeply about democracy, how can we, as people who have worked hard to create better districts, how can we leverage this opportunity to encourage those districts to be put to good use? And that might be finding a candidate and offering to help them with petition signatures. It might be encouraging somebody in one of those districts without an incumbent and saying, you know what, this is when you should run. It might be talking with folks in minority organizations to say, how can we be training folks to be prepared to run? Or are there people who have just been waiting for an opportunity? Do they need funding? How can we help? And Fair Districts PA will be working a lot with the League of Women Voters on poll worker training and on registering voters, because a lot of voters have not bothered. They've felt like, I don't have a choice. Why should I go? And we want to say, this is a really important election in Pennsylvania. I think it's the first time in decades. It is the first time in 20 years. We have a governor. Maybe it's longer than that. We have a governor, we have a state senator, and we have new districts, and we have all of these empty seats. So it's a really important election, and we really want to make sure that these new districts are put to good use, to encourage civic engagement, to encourage people to vote, and to see new voices in our legislature, and to see a more accountable legislature. So I'm going to stop screen share. And those who have been looking at questions, Amy, Ruth, are there questions that we need to answer that you want to suggest?
I think HB 2207 has gotten a lot of upvotes that hasn't really been addressed yet.
Okay, so HB 2207 is a bad bill. Let's just say it's a bad bill put forward by Representative Seth Grove as a way to capture control of the redistricting process. It has a commission, and to be honest, there's, how is the commission chosen? Legislators are choosing commissioners, county commissioners are choosing commissioners. The court is choosing a commissioner. That none of that matters at all, because the way the bill is written, whatever the commission does, the legislators can vote down their proposed map and then draw their own map and pass it as a simple resolution. The governor doesn't get to veto it, and it needs no vote. It needs not one vote from the other party. So the party in control can vote down a map, draw their own map, pass it as a resolution. The House controls their own map. The Senate controls their own map. It puts redistricting squarely in the hands of the people who have the most to gain by drawing their own districts. It's a very bad bill, and it's a constitutional amendment, so the governor can't veto it. Fortunately, it has been passed over this week, and when it was on the calendar before. I think a lot of that has to do with people pushing back. So thank you. All of those who made calls, all of those who emailed legislators. I think often they hope that they will do one of these toxic amendments, push it through fast. No one will notice. It will land on the ballot. And people often vote just because they think, oh, the legislature did due diligence. This must be okay. We'll vote for it. No, they do not do due diligence. They do not invite expert testimony. They push things through very quickly on a party line vote. And if we as the people say we're watching and we think this is a bad bill and we're going to make a lot of noise, it causes them to slow down and to think, and that's our goal. So it has not moved forward. If it starts to move again, we will push back hard. And the other bill that we've been watching, House Bill 38, would create judicial districts. That one's even more worrisome because it already passed once. And so it just needs to pass again, and it could go on the ballot. The fact that it was also passed over this week means it's very unlikely it will be on the ballot in the primary unless the primary gets pushed back a lot. And I saw some mention that it might be pushed to June or July. I really doubtful that the primary would be in July, but it's possible it will get pushed until June. And an amendment would have to be passed 3 months before the next primary. So they're out until sometime in March 21st, the House is due back. So March, April, May, June. We think it's probably too late for them to try to get it on the primary, but we'll certainly be watching that. Any other questions that we want to take a look at?
Do you want to give an update on the congressional map situation?
Sure, I'll give an update on the congressional map situation. I know there were questions about specifics on the maps. I don't know, Anne, if you want to be ready to kind of, are there more on the House or the Senate side?
I think we answered most of the specific ones, although
Okay.
people did want to zoom on Philadelphia in the,
Okay.
the House and Senate maps.
Okay, so if you want to have those maps ready to go, I'll give an update on the congressional map situation. So Commonwealth Court had hearings. They had some amazingly good experts. They had some very good maps. There were 4 maps submitted by citizen groups, and Hanna was part of a group, Concerned Citizens for Democracy. They submitted a map. Michael Waxenberg and others were part of the Draw the Lines group that submitted a map for the citizens map that was submitted by Draw the Lines. Michael Waxenberg, Ruth Yeiser, and I were part of a group that helped draw the map for the Ali interveners, which was submitted. And the other citizen map, which I call a citizen map, was the Gressman Math and Science map, which was done by some math and science professors using an algorithm, which kind of surprised us at how good it was. So those 4 citizen maps were submitted. There were also maps submitted by Democratic House and Senate, Republican House, and 2 very bad maps submitted by some past and current elected officials, and lots of testimony. And as I said earlier, the testimony of what I would consider the 2 most unqualified to give testimony was the testimony that the judge leaned on most heavily in her decision. And if you want to read our comment, our most recent update, in fact, somebody can throw that in the chat, our update just this morning about the map kind of summarizes what we think about it. The legal it was a 228-page recommendation. A lot of circular logic, a lot of really bad logic, and I'm hoping that the Supreme Court does a fine job of responding to that. And I will be very surprised if they choose the map that she recommended, which was the map that the House and Senate passed, but the governor vetoed it. I can't imagine that they will choose it. It was the most partisan of the maps submitted in terms of partisan bias. And many of the other maps were quite good. Will they choose one of those, or will they have a special master draw a new one? We don't know. There will be a hearing on the 18th, and then we'll find out. So, Anne, do you want to show us a map, or are there other questions that we want to tackle?
I'm happy to do a screen share when, no, here it is. All right, can you see my map, everybody?
Yes.
Perfect. So I know some people had some questions about Philadelphia, and I guess I should keep the chat window open so I can see what they are. Apologies. I don't know what I did with the chat window. Oh, well, okay. If people see questions about Philadelphia in the chat window, please convey them to me orally. All right, so here is a zoom on Philadelphia in the House map side. I'll zoom out maybe just a little more. I think, and I'll also just put really quickly an overlay of the preliminary district lines on Philadelphia, so you can see what changed from preliminary maps. The orange outlines now are the preliminary LRC map lines. The biggest change in Philadelphia was probably that they changed. You can see most of this isn't a huge change from the preliminary map. There's like a few little edges that got changed in a few places. Like you can see here, this green district changed a little bit in a few spots. But the biggest change was changing the 194th and whatever that purple district is, the right, the 194th, the 200th, which, as you can see, changed from putting Chris Rabb in the same district as Pam Delisio. This is a Democrat on Democrat primary, that a lot of people were very upset about. And so they changed it to create a different Democrat on Democrat primary, which is now Chris Rabb and Isabella Fitzgerald. And I'm actually a little bit distressed about this one, because the reason that they had to pair two representatives in Philadelphia was because they were creating, well, partly because just Philadelphia was a horrible tangle of gerrymandered nonsense, and they're trying to undo that, but also because they're trying to create this new open 203rd district here, which it looks like Jared Solomon's in it, but he's actually in the red district. The 203rd is this pale green one here. And they're trying to create an open majority minority district there, which they did. But the price of this is they've now ended up pairing two Black representatives in the same district. And so I'm not really sure what was gained by doing that. I feel like they heard people screaming and they responded to the screaming, but they didn't think very hard about it because they really wanted to keep this 203rd district as an empty district. And it really is very hard to untangle this region over here. I'm not, you know, I've tried to find alternatives, and it actually is very hard to find a reasonable alternative that doesn't involve like drawing like a weird, like you could draw like a weird long line over here and pull Fitzgerald maybe into this district or something, but it's not easy, and it does make the districts a little bit more convoluted. So that was kind of the only really big change they made in Philadelphia. They, on the House side, are there any questions that specific questions that people have?
Well, I think one question people have is why did one block move to, you know, from one district to another? Why does one section move from one to another? And a lot of that has to do with population shift. If you remember, there's been population growth in the Philly area, and also the reallocation of prison data means that, you know, there's changes in the way the population is. The population deviation needs to be kept to a certain level, and that does require changes. Also, some of it has to do with, you know, creating minority districts. So looking at where minority populations are and shifting things gently. I had been curious for years, what district is it now? Is it 177, the one that Joe Hohenstein, Representative Hohenstein? Just, do you have the old map available that you could pull up?
I put the outlines here so you can see them, but I will also pull up the old map real quick. Just looking real quickly, you can see this horrible purple tangle all over everything that I just put on top is the old district lines. You can see why it is hard to untangle something like this while still trying to avoid incumbent contests.
If you could pull up the old one, I think that
I will load the actual old one so you can see.
Yeah, the old one.
Here.
So actually, I was not, you know, I had seen this, and you know, there's certain things in Philly, and you think, well, that couldn't have been done for partisan advantage because Philly is, you know, primarily Democratic, and what, you know, there must be some odd story. And then there was a letter to the editor from some current and past representatives complaining about the changes. And I thought, well, I'm just going to look at these folks' districts because here they are complaining, and let's see what their districts look like. And the legislator who had been in District 177 had been there for decades. And I looked and I thought, okay, that explains it, because here's a white Republican who lived in Kensington. And if you know Kensington, I actually was a youth pastor who did mission trips in Kensington. And when I started doing them in 1999, Kensington was a community in transition. It had been a white working class community that lost a lot of jobs. And then, you know, in the very early 2000s, there were minority families moving in. A lot of Latinos moved into the housing there, large families in places where there had been, you know, maybe one aging white homeowner. And that population shifted very quickly. And what I realized in looking at this map was that legislator had, you know, so he lived kind of right where that the flag for Joe Hohenstein is. That's kind of where this legislator lived, and they were busy trying to find him white Republicans in an area that had become extremely diverse and extremely Democratic. So yeah, there you go.
So here's
that
district
explain that.
lines.
But when you look at the map, you realize that there was a great deal of work to try to firm up to get rid of some of that bizarreness that had been going on for decades. And that was a lot of work. And that did mean changes. And so, you know, when we look at things, unfortunately, we can't know, was that because an incumbent wanted it that way? Was that to fix something that had happened before? Was that to maximize minority representation? There's lots of questions. Sometimes we can see the answers. Sometimes we can't, but you can end your screen share because we're gonna finish up. Our time is coming to an end. I just want to say again, the maps that we have are far better than what they were. They are not as good as we would like. We still have a process that gives priority to 4 caucus leaders, and the maps do a better job for minority representation. And if people push back on that, ask them, you know, what their evidence is, who they're listening to, and if the people they're listening to really care, they need to show it in ways other than attacking these maps. And that is a message I would like to give directly to our Majority Leader, Kerry Benninghoff. If he cares about minority representation, he needs to pass some of those bills introduced by minority legislators, and he needs to get experts who know what they're talking about. And he could have invited experts on the Voting Rights Act. He did not do that. But we would like to hear from his voting rights experts before he opines on this topic any further. And I would encourage you to look for ways to support new candidates, look for ways to get involved in the election, and we will do our best to keep you informed. We'll be sending you an email with links and with information, and we appreciate you being here. We appreciate you being part of this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.